Hello from Nam, where I am once again living and working on unceded Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country, and where I'm settling into my second Melbourne adventure with a lot of coffee catch-ups, with a lot of governance reading and thinking, and unsurprisingly, after the last several months, a lot of conversations about organisational ethics, about what we do and how we do it, and how we behave while we're doing it. As usual, through the particular lens of arts, cultural and non-profit sector governance. For example, in this resource from our community on how to revitalise your community board, in the section on the ideal board, there's a subheading on board ethics that says a community or not-for-profit organisation is established to do good works. So it's important to ensure that the board operates ethically and works on developing trust in the organisation. It then goes on to say, and I'm paraphrasing, that the chair of the board should lead by example because if directors aren't seen to observe exemplary ethical standards, it's likely that their employees or the communities won't either. Reflecting on which has made me start to tie together several of the recurring themes or deficit areas, really, that I've been hearing over and over again in the conversations I'm having or the conversations I'm witnessing across and outside of our sector right now. The first of which can probably be summed up like this: a lack of general governance readiness for when things start to go wrong. Because our work was busy and difficult even before it was as busy and difficult as it is right now, so not many of our organisations were able to use that historical, or what feels like now mythological, quiet time to prepare for times of crisis, let alone times of polycrisis like we're in the midst of right now. Which is further complicated, as I've said many times before, by the fact that our organisations aren't set up, our decision-making structures aren't set up to do things at speed, so that when crises hit, as they seem to be doing with alarming frequency and potency, we are often ill-equipped to do anything about them. And that may be due to a lack of time, a lack of resources, or just headspace, either as an organisation or in terms of the personal, emotional capacity of the humans within that organisation, who, I don't know about you, but in my circles are pretty much all experiencing some level of brokenness or burnout at the state of the sector and or the state of the world right now. Or it could be due to lack of clear community engagement pathways for us to ask and listen to our communities, to check in with them, particularly in instances where our elected representatives, our board members, so often don't reflect the communities that they're set up to represent in the first place. Or it could be because of a lack of existing agreed policies or established procedures, or finding the ones that we do have aren't actually fit for purpose when they're put to the test. One of the key ways we're seeing this last example happening brings me to my second key deficit or theme, which is around organisational ethics and values, which most of us have in some form articulated, maybe as part of our strategic plan or our code of conduct, maybe an ethics or partnership framework or other policy documents. Unfortunately, not many of them are proving to be as robust as we'd once hoped from the well-catered theoretical musings of long past planning days. Which means that we again need to ask questions like who set them in the first place and how, who was in the room and who was excluded either intentionally or accidentally. And are the values that those people came up with actually representative of our board and our staff and our members and our communities? But also, what do those values mean? How do we embed them? How do we walk the talk? And perhaps more controversially, but important for the next phase of the conversation, in setting and reinforcing those values, which of our stakeholder groups will we prioritise and in what circumstances? Because embedding those values into the way that we work, into our risk and crisis management, into meeting our duty of care, must come surely from using those values as a filter to inform ethical, values-based decision-making, to give us guidance on what happens when our members or broader constituents don't agree, what happens in the face of disproportionate lobbying or complaints. Who do we listen to? Do we listen to the largest group or the loudest group, or the ones who represent or are closer to our core purpose? How do we balance or reconcile those various duties of care? And then how do we communicate what we're doing? How do we, in the first place, make sure that we have the information, the wisdom and the representation we need to consider those kind of questions in good faith and in good time? To work through just one example, we know that no big decision should be made alone, particularly in times of crisis. And I was reminded of that with this book, Governance Now, The Hidden Challenge of Leadership, which came out of the UK's Cultural Leadership program. And it says that ignorance is not bliss. The creative and financial decisions made by organisations cannot be made in a vacuum. In fact, every organisation needs critical friends who are confident enough to hold up a mirror to the organisation and to give it tough love feedback on how it is perceived by its staff and the wider world outside the organisation. However, while the types of communication that happens in a crisis should not be a replacement for genuine ongoing community engagement and consultation, they also present us with an example of the need to be clear when it comes to valued-informed decision-making, because delaying decisions in order to be fully informed by the full gamut of our stakeholders may sound like an ethical approach on the one hand, but it may be offset by making our communities, making our donors and our artists and our audiences wait as a consequence, and maybe impacting our fiduciary duties and our financial bottom lines if they choose to divest from our organisations in the meantime. Similarly, acknowledging that genuine community engagement on a crisis issue could add a lot of extra workload onto our already stretched teams could be seen as a values-led decision, but using their well-being as an excuse to not engage at all could also be seen as an ethical cop-out, which is just one example of the sort of complex conversations happening in boardrooms all over the country at the moment, all of which are obviously further exacerbated when there's a misalignment, as again is happening too often right now, between what the staff and team value and how they want to respond, and between the values and desires and decisions of the board. Which brings me to my third and final deficit theme for now anyway. I have the depressing feeling that they're going to keep coming, but which is the decimation of our formal and informal codes of conduct and terms of engagement, our ways of being and communicating with each other, which in a sector torn apart by hurt and grief and harm and fear, I have never seen at a lower point in my 25 plus year career, which is understandable on some level. There is genuine hurt caused by genuinely harmful behaviours, whether they were intended or not, justified or not, aligned with our personal or organisational values or not. I have caused some, I'm sure. I have been on the receiving end too, and I am not a member of any of the communities closest to the largest ongoing issues or the grief that those issues continue to cause, for whom that harm is disproportionately greater. And of course, none of us are, nor should be expected to be, our best or most calm or articulate selves right now. To be fair, none of us have been for quite a long time. And of course, broken people break people. Unfamiliar or shocking or previously unimaginable situations often prompt individuals and organisations to respond in unfamiliar or shocking or previously unimaginable ways. So harm begets harm begets harm. And within that context, those who have been historically oppressed, silenced or marginalised or continue to be so, those who are on the receiving end of systemic, organisational and peer-to-peer harm, should not be tone policed or expected to share their experience in a way that is sanitised or palatable to others, should not be told to calm down, should not be told to get on with it. Particularly when that harm isn't historical, isn't theoretical. Our sector is tearing itself apart in real time on our watch. Which means it's hard to see a way through this cycle when we're seeing the normalisation of what until very recently would have been considered completely inappropriate behaviours: direct and indirect abuse, censorship and silencing, attacks on employment and livelihood, individual and organisational threats, breaches of trust, and lateral violence between allies, to name just a few, not to mention the exposure of systemic racism, religious intolerance, and lower than low cultural safety that have always, to our shame, been baked into our organisations and sector, and that are no longer bubbling away below the surface, but in too many cases being doubled down. So it's hard to imagine what our sector could look like if and when we get to the other side, whatever that means. When people are hurting too much to even imagine being in a room with each other, to reflect without re-triggering, to discuss without inflicting further damage, to imagine when healing might be possible, and what scars might be left behind if it is, to imagine the prospect of how and when and what might happen next. And this holds true for relationships between sector peers, relationships and misalignments between boards and CEOs, boards and staff teams, or CEOs and their staff, the behaviours of boards as collective entities, the behaviour of individual board members, and the behaviours of chairs in particular, which is another area we're seeing some high-profile failures that loops us right back round to our first two deficit points, because chairs or board members that breach our constitutions or our codes of conduct or even legislative responsibilities, as we're seeing cases of them doing now, or chairs whose behaviour doesn't reflect their organisational values, operating in an environment when our organisations don't necessarily have systems in place so that the people on the ground know how to address those issues whilst speaking to power. How can other board members hold those chairs and peers accountable? Because that's your job too. Arts and culture have traditionally been ways we have brought people together and held space for conversation and for new and challenging ideas, where we've shifted paradigms and changed minds and saved lives. But with the people who make or engage in those processes, in that storytelling, in that gathering and sharing, more depleted, and the state of the sector they work in more tenuous than many of us have ever known, how do we hold and care for those who do the work of holding and caring for others? How do we recenter our commonality and our shared humanity without being dismissive in any way of the hurt? How do we re-articulate and recommit to our personal and organisational values to make sure we practice what we preach? How can those of us who are a bit further away from the grief use our emotional capacity to support those closer to the centre? And how do we create safe spaces for honesty and multiplicity alongside civility and respect? I don't know. There is no formula for this. There are no experts. There are no precedents in most of our careers. In this book, Culture is Not an Industry, by Justin O'Connor, he suggests that the kind of radical reinvention would have to be local, adaptive, and experimental. As a start, that might actually mean hyper-local, having these sorts of values-based discussions at board level, in boards' pastoral care of their CEOs, within staff and artistic teams, and in the interconnections between those and other stakeholder groups, checking in, asking, listening, trying, and perhaps sharing what trying looks like with others, even as just another clumsy contribution like this one in a long, large, messy conversation of which we're all taking part. Take care out there all.